We have a number of heartbeats in our lives. Those heartbeats are never wasted if you're exploring things.
Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are purely individual and do not represent that of the colleges that are a part of it.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second episode of this series with KVDF. I'm Nachal Magan.
And I'm Agrima Mangle.
From CEPT University, Ahmedabad. Today we have Ant from Frankie Pappas giving us an insight into his work and how he's established his practice in South Africa. They've recently been voted as one of the top 20 emerging architects in the world. Frankie creates an environment enabling coders, engineers, mathematicians, artists, managers, and architects to collaborate under one roof. From large scale to small scale, from urban design to buildings to furniture and art, Frankie makes spaces, objects, experiences, and places that people write songs about. They describe themselves as a collective, and their mantra is wonderfully similar, incredibly different. Hi, Ant. Welcome. We're extremely excited to have you here with us. I thought maybe we could start off with you telling us a little bit about when and how you started Frankie Pappas.
Guys, thanks so much for having me on and letting me speak a lot of rubbish. I hope I'll keep the rubbish to a minimal, but I can't promise anything. The things that begun Frankie Pappas is quite an involved story. As out of varsity, out of school, architecture school, I had decided to work for 3 firms in particular, and they're all really good design firms, and all had been invited to exhibit at the Venice Biennale. They were all also quite socially involved architects and remarkable designers. The thing, though, is that they were all white males and all named after themselves. And in doing that, I think what gets set up is the idea of coming to work and working to produce someone else's vision or someone else's dream. I think what's in service of someone's ego, that's how I felt. I think as an architect, you should be in service of the buildings and the cities you're creating rather than the ego of anyone, especially that of a white male. I think white males like myself, we've got enough ego already, so we don't need any pandering to that. So that was number one, the fact that I was going to work for everyone for 2 years, and that's what I did. And I was going to learn from them as much as possible, the good and the bad, and set up a firm. I didn't know what that firm was going to look like. And that firm ended up being Frankie Pappas. And Frankie Pappas is a collective pseudonym, and there is no Frankie Pappas. The reason for the name Frankie Pappas is that Frankie is gender neutral. And I always just thought that name was quite wonderful. Particularly because of that. And then a bit more nerdy and a bit deeper dive into the name was that there's a band, 1970s glam rock band called Motley Crue. The band took its name from a book written by Willard Manus. I'm lying to you, not Motley Crue, Mott the Hoople. Motley Crue is a seriously good band. Mott the Hoople. Mott the Hoople was a book written by Willard Manus. And in that book, the main character is Mott, and he's kind of a difficult character to like. And his best friend, and I use friend in inverted commas, is a guy called Frankie Pappas. The one thing he did always was buck the trend. So he would, however someone else wanted him to live his life, he would do pretty much the exact opposite. And I thought that was kind of how we were going to do things. So if it was standard practice for architecture firms to have an office, we would not have an office. If they had a server on site, we would not have a server on site. Ours would be based virtually and in California. So it was kind of just a whole bunch of nerdy things that aligned, and that's where we took our name from.
I think that's really interesting. And what is your ideal workspace like?
Our workspace is that we don't have any. I'm personally obsessed with efficiencies in the city. I carry those efficiencies into Frankie as much as possible. So we don't have any workspace. The workspace that we have is whatever people feel comfortable with. And we have people working, obviously, with us in Europe, and we have people on the subcontinent working with us, and we have people in the US working with us. And I hope that it will, we'll have people working on every continent with us soon. So in short, my ideal working space is personally outside on the balcony, and I have a desk there, and that's for me the best place to work.
That sounds lovely.
So I was thinking that since it's a multidisciplinary firm, what are the different kind of projects that you guys take up, and how do these different categories affect each other if they do?
Okay, so I'll start that answer off with just defining what these categories are. We have predominantly, at the moment, we are architecture focused. So we have the homemakers, which does smaller and residential projects. And then we have the city makers, and that does larger, more public work. So those are the two architecture, I suppose, divisions in Frankie. And the reason we divide it is you require different infrastructure to build those different projects. Then we have furniture makers, which is just a way for us to, we end up producing a lot of furniture for our work, designing it, often building it. And so that is currently just a way of documenting that information. And the art makers is similar. It costs money, but it's just a way for us to collaborate on ideas. So a good example of this, I would say, is I think it's film in a single image. I'm not sure what exactly the title of this gallery was called, but I was dabbling in writing code at that time while I was just wanted to learn Python so that I could get into understanding the logic of scripting. And I had this idea that over some wine, that with some friends, that maybe we could reduce an entire film down into a single image, if we could collapse this whole thing and watch an entire film in one image. And then during this dinner, we had lots of talks about how we would do this. Eventually, that evening, wrote some script. And this is super collaborative. I mean, this is over wine. This is in an evening that we're doing this stuff, and it's with an artist and an astrophysicist, and we're just writing this code and trying to find out how we're going to make it work. And so there are three people that would never have worked together on a project that we finish this project literally in an hour. We write that code, and then that code can be run out in any film that you want. So it's stuff like that is super interesting. And then what that leads to is an understanding of what this code can do and how far we can pull it. And then we move into other things like scraping data, property data off multiple sources and consolidating that. Like I'm talking about geospatial data, property value data, and then finding out where good places for investment, for property investment are in the city. And that's got to do with a whole bunch of things, including urban opportunities like education, economic opportunities, healthcare opportunities, social and cultural opportunities. And we map all that and then find places that we can invest our money, our capital, in places that we think are going to be valuable portions of the city. What I'm trying to get to in this whole rambling explanation is there's something as simple as a piece of art that we were writing that morphs into, over time, opens up other opportunities to look at mapping of a city to see where property investment can be done. And I think without that tapping into different minds, we wouldn't get to a place like that. So even though furniture makers cost us money, art makers cost us money, and then it's just a stupid thing we do called thought makers, and that's just writing our ideas down and compiling them. I don't think you get to an understanding. You just miss opportunities to do more interesting work. And that's really why we do these things. There's no capital intent behind them at the moment. I hope in the future, but at the moment they're,
So in KVDF, we are trying to delve deeper into the network within which the profession of architecture operates. The different agencies that are involved include, but are not necessarily limited to social, contextual, ecological factors that make up the complex ecosystem of the built environment. Based on this, could you tell us a little bit about how you conceptualize your projects and what agencies dictate your design decisions?
Okay, so this is a really good question. I think it's a question that's more pertinent to the global south than it is to the global north, at least how I understand our educations, our architectural educations coming to fruition. I think, so if you grow up in a context where there is scarcity, and I'm not saying for one second that I've experienced scarcity, I've always had a roof over my head, never gone to bed hungry, but I am aware that it exists because I'm surrounded by it. And I think the same would be for people in India. I think you're surrounded by it, there's no escape from it. And I think this is quite a generalization for areas in the global south. And so when you grow up in an area where you're exposed to scarcity, you are forced to rationalize your decisions. I think that's a very good thing. And the better you can rationalize your decisions, the better of an architect you're going to be. Personally, I see architecture not as a function of invention. I don't think there should be any invention in architecture. I think it is purely a function of discovery. What I mean by that is, if you take seriously the parameters that are going to shape your project, and that I mean social issues, and I mean things like crime, how do we all contribute to the reduction in crime? And that is that you can zoom out as far as you want in that one. Then the environmental issues that we're all going to have, the client needs, there's the ecological issues there, we're trying to get everything off the grid. There are resource issues, that is what building materials are within 50 kilometers of where you're building. There are all these issues that I see them as lines in the sand. So you draw those lines in the sand and your building shapes itself. So this is like a multi-dimensional problem that we're trying to build up. And once that problem gets shaped correctly, you put the correct lines where they need to be, your building's going to design itself. And that's what I mean by a function of discovery. I don't see this as modernist principles, not at all. I see these, or maybe it's modernist principles taken further. Because if you look at someone like Mies van der Rohe, his focus was far too small. He was focusing on the junction between two elements. And generally those were steel and glass, and that's where his focus was. And because of that, his buildings are bad. They're really horrible buildings. If we look at Farnsworth House, it floods periodically, and it requires an entire, once it was taken over, it needs an entire air conditioning system buried under the ground, under the building, in order to make this building habitable. That's a really bad architecture.
So much of Corbusier's work and how much we as architecture students really study modernist buildings. I think once we put them in context of the global south and the context that we're brought up in, a lot of those things just don't work and they just don't function. And I think that importance of context that you're bringing up right now is something that I think we've all in India as well really faced and understood as architecture students.
Yeah, I think it's not only that they don't work in the global south, they didn't work in the north either. Farnsworth House will not work anywhere in the world. It's a really bad building, and we should just be honest about it and say, architecture students, this was produced. We must not do that again, please, guys. This is bad, and we should be serious about it. We should also understand who Mies van der Rohe was. We should understand that he was very happy to be the architect of the Nazi Party. he was very happy to do that. He lost the commissions to Albert Speer and so therefore left to the United States. And the fact that this gets swept under the rug is insane. And I think there's something to be said about this, and this is the important thing, is that we talk about our Gini coefficient, which is really a measure of inequality in an area. So the Gini coefficient of South Africa, I think, is the highest in the world, if not this. It's in the top 10, if not the top 1. It's really terrible, and it's a demonstration of how unequal our society is. A place like Sweden is very equal. So it is a very low Gini coefficient. But the most important Gini coefficient we can look at is the Gini coefficient of the world. And the Gini coefficient of the world is higher than any individual country in the world. So our entire world is less equal than the least equal place on earth. So a war-ravaged country like Sudan or the DRC is more equal than our entire world. What that says to me is that our established countries in the global north, and this is no secret, I don't think it's controversial to say this, they're outsourcing their inequality. So an iPhone or a piece of IKEA furniture is cheaper to produce in China because we're outsourcing our inequality, we're outsourcing our cheap labor, and we're importing a project or a product back. And the architecture of the global north is a product of that industry, of being able to be inefficient and being able to be, call it like inventive in architecture, where there's very little rationale behind the work that is being produced in the global north. In general, there are great architects in Europe and America, make no doubt about it. Alvar Aalto, for instance, is one of the greatest architects to have ever lived, I think. But I think he was left the modernist movement because he understood the problems with it. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, it was really interesting to hear everything you said and all of the insights. And I think they're very pertinent to architecture as a profession currently. I think next what we'd like to hear a little bit about is in the design process, communication is really important. And as architects, we're equipped with the skill of visualization of technical drawings. So in what light do your collaborations kind of help you bridge that gap between the client and the labor on site or the general public?
So I think there are three different things there. There's, personally, I see the client as part of the professional team, as part of the team that's going to bring this project to fruition. So one has to put onus on one's client to really look through drawings, to study drawings. Obviously, you have an obligation to educate them in how drawings work, how plans work, for instance, and showing some 3Ds. Generally, I don't like to render anything. I think it is an expensive exercise and doesn't make for better designs. Often there may be scenarios where that is not the case. So I think the skill of being able to produce a drawing by hand very, very quickly and produce a 3D and communicate those ideas with the client are irreplaceable. With speaking to people on site, I think you must take your notebook with you as much as possible. And you go through one of those every 2 weeks or so, because you're drawing on site with people and explaining stuff. That knowledge transfer is super valuable. So I think drawing by hand, I think you must practice as much as you possibly can and learn how to draw super fast. I know it sounds old school, but I don't think you can beat the speed of hand drawing. And also being able to, this is a skill that I think everyone must learn, and I can't say I'm particularly good at it, but being able to paint pictures with words. And those, being able to draw and speak well about something is super valuable. So I think Those things are underrated. And I think we should bring those to the fore. Then communicating to the public is different. And I mean that about general non-architects who are not involved in the project. It won't come as a surprise that projects are not linear. They go through a whole bunch of revisions and variations, and they become incredibly squiggly things until they're at a point where they're right, and then you move quite linearly. So in communicating to the general public, we use what we call the explanatory ISOs. And so we have a very specific formula. It goes like the main drawing, which is generally a perspective drawing, which is done by hand, then photographs. Then we have an explanatory ISO, which runs you through the decisions of or the process of why certain decisions were made. In life, it's not as simple as this, but we explain it as simply as possible. We give the explanations behind the last revision. We then also do something which is super fun. We work with a cartoonist called Dr. Jack, and he draws cartoons of the buildings. Personally, I love it because he has complete disregard for architecture. He just wants to draw a beautiful drawing. And in doing that, he shows how spaces are used. He doesn't care about the geometries. Lines are not straight. They're as curved as, I don't know, obviously that building is never going to be built that way. And I think as architects, we kind of can't get our brains that way to just draw something as crazy as that. It's beautiful to look at these drawings and say, we could make our architecture crazier, more interesting if we kind of expanded our brains a little bit. So I think there are a bunch of different visualization techniques. The core fundamental of it is that you need to do it fast. And in doing it fast, the one thing you need to know is what you want to produce, what exactly you want to communicate. And if you know what you want to communicate, then you're not going to waste your time on the peripheral stuff. You need to communicate that specific thing and that specific thing only.
I think what really stayed with your answer with me was the fact that one, you think of the client as a part of the professional team, and you go and sit with the client and draw over with the client and explain every design decision, which I think is really interesting when the client the client also feels like he or she is a part of the entire design process. And also the way you have brought in Dr. Jack with a different view of how you represent the drawing. I think that's super interesting. We also wanted to know that what is the extent of the role of the architect in the execution of the design, and what is his involvement with the different agencies during the execution?
That's also a really good question. I think the architect's role has kind of been diminished over time. I've done one project in my life where it's under Frankie, that is where we have not controlled everything. So Frankie was only the architect. And I can say that project was poorer for it. So we were part of a professional team, and the professional team had another project manager, another landscape architect, another whatever. The team was not ours, and the project suffered hugely because of that. What I think we should be as architecture firms is the one being bandied about is multidisciplinary firms. I think that's a bit of a boring word, and it sounds very corporate, so I try to get away from that as much as possible. But your team should be a project manager if it requires that, but you will need a project manager, an architect, the engineering services, the landscaper, the landscaping architect or landscaper, whoever it is. You're also then going to have your design and supply guys, like the plumber, like the doors and windows, like the roofing. All these guys are designers who need to be part of your team. If they're not part of your team, I think you're going to struggle to align people. You need to have everyone on the same page and working to the same goal. Currently, how the industry is organized is that the whole professional team, remember on a big project, this can be 12 professionals. It's just about getting people to work as a team and to collaborate under a system that incentivizes collaboration and incentivizes working together well.
So on a very general note, that how does all of these collaborations with Dr. Jack or the coders or the astrophysicists that you talk about, how do all of these people affect your design thinking, and like how has it helped you grow as a person and also as a designer?
So I think that the general headline of it is one needs to be, I suppose, confident enough in oneself that you know you're wrong, because 95% of the time you're going to be wrong, and never get to a stage where you think you're right. That's the thing, is that you're going to meet with people smarter than you your whole life. I hope that's the case. Otherwise, you need to go find new friends, you know. The problem with our education, for instance, is that it is very siloed. We treat architecture, at least this was what happened in my education, is that we studied Le Corbusier and we studied Mies van der Rohe. We studied all these, you know, Aldo Rossi, all these guys who are one character. And it kind of gets built into your brain that this architect must be put on a pedestal and they're a genius and they produce all this work. It's crazy. It's not the way the world works. The brickie is as important as the architect, and I really do mean that. So I think the quicker you can understand that your job is, as an architect, your job is kind of that of curation. It's trying to find the idea, like put the lines in the sand, being kind of in charge of putting the lines in the sand and moving this building and then discovering it, and being the person who's organizing this, like a mass of people trying to build something. I mean, even a small house is going to be, including the brickie and plumber, and it's probably going to be 60, 70 people, and you need to communicate how we're going to get to this final thing. It's really not easy, and it's not the idea of your being the genius who draws something and lets other people do it. It's the marshalling. It's like just curating this whole experience, this whole system, and that's your job, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Anne. This was a really inspiring and insightful conversation. We would like to end this by asking you if you have any advice for young architects or architecture students who are aspiring to start their own practice.
So I think that my advice is go learn from some people. Be serious about who you're going to learn from. That is crucial. You're going to have to get someone that you respect and you can work for 2 or 3 years and get really good experience from these people. And hopefully they're going to be good humans that, you know, want to share knowledge with you. And once you've got enough of this and you think you're in a position and you've built enough cash reserves and maybe you've got a couple of projects going, then jump into it and go full steam and keep your expenses as low as possible and just like go for it 1,000%. And yeah, we need really good young architects, and I think there are those. I think the architects of this generation, this next generation, the young millennials, and I think they're Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I think they're going to be great architects. And we need to produce a climate that's making better architects than we had in the boomers. I think we need to just understand that we need to produce a great profession and great cities, and that's our goal. And so let's go do it. You know, it's not above anyone for us to go out there and make really great buildings and collectively great cities.
Thank you, Anne, for these thoughts that you have shared. I feel like it is very important for us as young architects to understand all of this. We pick off from this topic and address it at a larger scale in the next episode. So stay tuned.